While they were visiting the main Buddhist sites in India, far away in Tibet, the revolt had already begun in the provinces where Chinese oppression was heaviest. The voyage was about to end for the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama. How could they know their paths were about to separate forever?
Kawa, 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 ma, ma, yama, yama, pama, pama, jama, jama, pama, pama, pa, pa, kawa, kawa, pa, pa, kawa, 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 ma, ma, jama, jama.
This was the Chinese method. It began in school and continued on in the camps. The huge parcels of land belonging to the monasteries were grouped together and redistributed. Growing techniques were changed, and then the temples and monasteries were destroyed. Religious practices were made illegal. Arrests and purges became increasingly frequent. Traditional agriculture was ruined, and the first famines began. Over 3 years, rioting against oppression had increased in the central provinces. The resistance was becoming organized. The large remaining monasteries were the last oases against colonization. The Dalai Lama was 22 years old. He took his last exams before being awarded his full religious attribution. He developed the same gesture with his hands to emphasize questions and answers. From monastery to monastery. Dalai Lama means ocean of wisdom. The last illusion that Tibet could live freely with its culture and beliefs was shattered. With attacks and ambushes, the revolt continued. The resistance had spread all the way to Lhasa. The Chinese army struck back, but the Dalai Lama condemned violence of any kind in his messages. He was warned it was time to leave. During the night of March 17th, he put on a Chinese uniform, and with almost no escorts, he left the palace. Destination unknown. The inhabitants of Lhasa rose up, 20,000 civilians against 40,000 Chinese soldiers. The rioting lasted 3 days. It was put down violently and rapidly. Freedom was gone. The resistance had ended. Propaganda footage was shot to discredit the monks. There were thousands of deaths, more than 10,000 in Lhasa and at least 100,000 throughout the country. Everything was destroyed. The Dalai Lama was hiding in the mountain. The Chinese were looking for him, saying he had been kidnapped by counter-revolutionaries. The hiding out lasted 3 weeks. By the end of March, he was in India. The Tibetan government was no more. Lhasa was under siege and silent. Welcomed by Nehru, the Dalai Lama began life in exile. He has lived in exile ever since. The Dalai Lama desperately tried to tell the whole world about the genocide and repression taking place in Tibet. The Panchen Lama was still a hostage and the official Tibetan leader named by the Chinese. He renounced collaborating with the Chinese several times, and 5 years later offered his public support to the Dalai Lama. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison and then house arrest in Beijing. Tibet was completely annexed. The Chinese army continued south to straighten out its borders with India, which was now directly threatened. The future of the world was being played out elsewhere, in Berlin and in Cuba. The Cold War had little to do with India and Tibet. Nehru faced a war and was dealt a sharp defeat. The results were clear. The eastern provinces became a part of China. Only the former autonomous region kept the name Tibet, a means of isolating it. Then came the continuation of the Chinese method. But the Chinese propaganda did not show the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, of exhaustion and hunger. There was terror, torture, and rape. Monks were crucified, burned, and buried alive. Children were forced to kill their own parents. People fled across the mountains to escape the horror and the famine ravaging the country for more than 3 years. More than 100,000 people were able to join the Dalai Lama in India. At Dharamsala, he established a Tibetan government in exile, and on March 10, 1963, announced a democratic constitution. The violence and acts of resistance continued. They were known as the Special Border Force, a Tibetan underground commando unit trained and maintained by the CIA. Crossing a mountain pass, there was a moment for prayers. There was fighting and ambushes, typical partisan guerrilla warfare. For the Dalai Lama, this was not the right path. His message broadcast on the radio reminded Tibetans that violence was contrary to Buddhist principles and that he opposed it.
J'ai été très clair dès le début. Si les Tibétains choisissent la violence pour résister aux Chinois, alors je me retire de mes responsabilités.
During this time, the Red Guards reached Tibet. The last monasteries and temples still standing were razed to the ground. The Cultural Revolution continued another 10 years. It resulted in 1 million deaths, 1 out of every 6 Tibetan. These were the ruins of the monastery of Ganden, one of the largest, home to thousands of monks. An entire society and its culture were destroyed. In 1972, the Cold War was evolving. U.S. President Richard Nixon visited Beijing. China had become a member of the United Nations a year earlier. The uprisings, repression, and famine continued in Tibet.